Hello, my name is Brenna Mitchell, and today I'm going to show you how the vote is and has always been the foundation of our country's democracy. Our country, founded and governed by strong white men, left both African Americans and women seemingly voiceless until they gained the right to vote. Once the right to vote was gained by both women and African Americans, the door to change was opened up for both parties. Change led us to more change, and those changes led us to where we are today, in 2013, where discrimination based on race and gender is no longer tolerated.
In the year 1868, the 14th Amendment was ratified and granted citizenship to African Americans. 2 years later, in 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed, granting African Americans the right to vote. However, white Southerners went to great lengths to try to keep African Americans out of the polls. These methods included poll taxes, literacy tests, black codes and enforced segregation, white-only primaries, intimidation and violence, restrictive eligibility requirements, and even rewriting the state constitutions. It wasn't until 1965, when Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, that most African Americans began to vote. In 1872, the first African American governor was elected into the House of Representatives for 35 days after the previous governor was impeached. It would be another 117 years before another person of African American descent would become a governor of the United States. In 1869, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton formed the National Women's Suffrage Association. This group sought to gain suffrage for women by the means of congressional amendment to the Constitution. That same year, Lucy Stone and her husband Henry Blackwell formed the American Women's Suffrage Association. This group tried to gain the right to vote for women through amendments to individual state constitutions. In the year 1890, the two groups joined together, forming the National American Women's Suffrage Association. In 1919, the Women's Suffrage Amendment was passed by the House of Representatives and Senate and went to the states for ratification. August 20th, 1920, the 19th Amendment was signed, granting women the right to vote.
Previously, women and African Americans were suppressed in areas of education and employment because of their lack of a vote and their lack of a voice.
In the year 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed, freeing African Americans from slavery. At that time, only 10% of African Americans were literate. From the years 1867 to 1877, the Freedmen's Bureau opened up schools for African Americans. Now that schools were starting to be established for African Americans, their attendance in schools started to significantly increase from the years 1870 to 1880. In 1890, Jim Crow laws provided a setback for education of African Americans. These laws mandated a segregation of African Americans from whites. The separation led to inferior conditions in schools that African American children weren't in. However, by the year 1900, 57% of African Americans were literate, up by 47% from the year 1865. 1909, the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, was formed. From the years 1935 to 1950, racial equality and educational resources improved greatly. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled segregation in schools unconstitutional. In 1957, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights was formed to investigate and make recommendations for civil rights issues in America. 1964, the Federal Civil Rights Act was passed. This act outlawed major forms of discrimination based on race in schools. Up until now, schools for African American children operated under the separate but equal doctrine. Yes, they were separate from white schools, but equal, not so much. The civil rights legislation passed in 1957 and 1964 was voted on by well-intentioned politicians wanting to end race-based segregation in schools. Schools were officially ordered to desegregate in 1969, and separate education for African Americans came to an end white resistance was very high. In 1980, racial differences in grade completion narrowed, and by 2007, according to the U.S. Census, 19% of African Americans had completed at least 4 years of college. In the 1800s, coeducation of men and women became more common. Yet more often than not, men received superior education to women. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed and outlawed discrimination based on gender. And finally, in 1972, the Education Amendment Act outlawed any discrimination based on gender, including inferior education of women. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation ordered the freedom of African American slaves. That same year, the first all-African American regular Army regiment was formed. In the year 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which made the enslavement of African American slaves illegal. In that same year, the Freedmen's Bureau was established and provided assistance to the newly freed slaves. The Bureau provided things like food, clothing, education, and employment, which would eventually lead African Americans to full American citizenship. In 1866, the Civil Rights Act was passed and granted African American citizenship. Black codes restricted African Americans' freedom. These laws helped whites to regain control over their freed slaves and maintain superiority. In 1909, the NAACP, or the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, was founded with the goal to ensure political, educational, social, and economic equality of rights of all persons. In 1947, racial barriers in professional baseball were broken when Jackie Robinson was signed with the Brooklyn Dodgers. 1 year later, President Harry S. Truman integrated the U.S. Army. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed major forms of racial discrimination in the workplace. Enforcement of this act was initially weak but grew over the years. Our first African American president, Barack Obama, was elected in 2009. In 1900, less than 20% of women were in the workforce. In 1914, women entered the workforce in large numbers to replace men who had gone off to fight in World War I. The same thing happened in 1940 when women entered the workforce once again in large numbers to replace men who had gone off to fight in World War II. In 1963, President Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act, which made it illegal to pay men more than women for the same jobs. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act outlawed discrimination in the workforce based on gender. By 1970, women began to enroll in universities in much higher numbers and entered into professions such as medicine, business, and law. Between 1984 and 2009, the amount of women in the workforce increased from 44 million to 72 million.
That brings us to where we are today. In the year 2013, there's an equal playing field for both men and women and for people of all races and backgrounds. In the year 2013, we live in a society where law provides equal opportunities for all. Just as change has brought us to this place, changes to come will bring us even further.